21 soldiers, 10,000 warriors, one impossible stand. In the remote mountains of the northwest frontier, a small stone fort named Saragarhi became the stage for one of history's greatest acts of courage. Surrounded, outnumbered, and cut off from the world, these 21 men chose honor over life, holding their ground until the very end. What really happened that day? Why did they fight when retreat was possible? And how did their sacrifice echo across empires for more than a century? Stay with us, because the story of Saragarhi isn't just about war. It's about the power of faith, duty, and the unbreakable spirit of 21 brave souls. Subscribe now, and discover how 21 soldiers changed history forever. The year was 1897. High in the rugged mountains of the northwest frontier, between what is now Pakistan and Afghanistan, stood a small stone outpost named Saragarhi. It was little more than a cluster of walls and watchtowers built from rough, sun-bleached rocks. Around it stretched a vast wilderness of dry hills and wind-carved valleys, a place where silence carried the weight of centuries and every gust of dust told stories of forgotten empires. At this lonely post, 21 Sikh soldiers of the 36th Sikh Regiment were stationed. Their duty was simple, yet vital: to guard the communication line between two larger forts, Fort Lockhart and Fort Gulistan, both perched on distant ridges that could be seen on a clear day. A heliograph, a clever device using mirrors to send flashes of sunlight, was their only lifeline to the outside world. The soldiers were far from home, surrounded by harsh terrain and uncertain peace. But to them, duty was not a burden. It was a sacred promise. They wore their turbans with pride, their neatly kept beards framed by the golden light of dawn. Their leader, Havildar Ishar Singh, was a man of quiet strength. His eyes held the calm of someone who understood both war and honor. Every morning, Ishar Singh would stand atop the fort's parapet and look toward the horizon. Beyond those ridges lay tribes who had never accepted foreign rule. Among them, anger was rising once again. Rumors had begun to drift like mountain smoke. Thousands of warriors were gathering under the banners of rebellion. They had one goal: to reclaim their land from the empire that had built forts upon their hills. Inside Saragarhi, life continued with disciplined routine. At sunrise, the men prayed together, reciting hymns from the Guru Granth Sahib, their holy scripture. At midday, they polished their rifles, maintained the walls, and signaled messages to Fort Lockhart. When evening came, they sat around a small fire, sharing simple meals of lentils and bread, their laughter echoing softly across the barren slopes. It was a life of isolation, but also of quiet dignity. Each soldier carried memories of family: mothers who prayed for their sons' safety, children waiting in distant Punjab villages, and wives who watched the setting sun with both pride and fear. Yet they all knew that service came before comfort. They had sworn to protect this post, no matter the odds. One day, as the autumn wind swept through the valley, the peace began to tremble. From the distant hills came faint echoes, the rhythmic beat of drums and the deep hum of gathered voices. Smoke rose from campfires far beyond sight. The heliograph flashed a message from Fort Lockhart: "Large tribal movement detected. Be alert." The men exchanged silent glances. No one spoke of fear. They had faced danger before, but this felt different, heavier, inevitable. Havildar Ishar Singh ordered every man to his position. The gates were secured, ammunition was checked, and the heliograph operator remained at his station, ready to relay messages even under threat. That night, the stars burned bright and cold. Ishar Singh sat awake near the parapet, his gaze fixed on the mountains. Another soldier, Lance Naik Chanda Singh, approached quietly. "Do you believe they will come, Havildar Sahib?" he asked. "They will come," Ishar Singh replied calmly. "And when they do, we will stand." The younger soldier nodded, drawing courage from his leader's voice. "Even if they are many?" "Even then," Ishar Singh said, his tone steady as stone. "A soldier's duty is not to count his enemies, but to remember his oath." From the darkness came the faint glow of distant fires. Too many to count. The drums grew louder, echoing through the night. Saragarhi's walls, though humble, seemed to stand taller beneath the stars, as if the spirit of every soldier before them had gathered there in silent witness. When dawn broke, the first rays of sunlight fell upon faces filled with resolve. The enemy had not yet appeared in full view, but the soldiers knew that the storm was near. They prayed once more, their voices rising above the wind, reciting words that spoke of courage, truth, and sacrifice. To those men, Saragarhi was not merely a fort, it was a symbol, a sacred line drawn between duty and despair. It represented everything they believed in: loyalty, faith, and honor. As the sun climbed higher, the heliograph flashed again. Fort Lockhart signaled that scouts had confirmed the gathering of thousands of tribal warriors moving toward Saragarhi. The message ended with a single word: "Prepare." Ishar Singh read it, nodded once, and turned to his men. "My brothers," he said, his voice firm yet warm, "our post stands alone, but we do not stand alone. The spirit of our Guru is with us. We have been chosen not by chance, but by purpose. Let no man think of retreat. Let us serve with the same faith we have always kept." A quiet determination filled the air. Every soldier returned to his station. Some adjusted their uniforms, some whispered prayers, and others smiled faintly, knowing that they stood at the edge of history. Outside the walls, the dust of 1,000 feet began to rise, a distant cloud slowly moving closer. Inside, 21 hearts beat in unison, bound by honor and faith stronger than fear. Thus began the story of Saragarhi, not a tale of conquest, but of courage, not a legend of victory, but of valor that time itself could never erase. Long before the sun rose on the day of Saragarhi's defense, the frontier where it stood had already been a land shaped by fire, faith, and endless conflict. To understand what led 21 men to stand against 10,000, one must first understand the land itself, the northwest frontier of British India, where mountains met empires and peace was as fragile as dust in the wind. By the late 19th century, the British Empire stretched across vast territories and India was its brightest jewel. Yet the empire's northwestern border, where the tall peaks of the Hindu Kush cast long shadows, remained unstable. Here lived the Pashtun tribes, fiercely independent people who valued honor, freedom, and faith above all else. For centuries they had resisted any foreign power, whether Persian, Mughal, or British. In these wild lands, the British had built a chain of small forts to secure the route between India and Afghanistan. Among them stood Fort Lockhart and Fort Gulistan, both commanding the Samana Range. Between these two outposts lay a gap of a few miles, and to bridge that gap stood the small signal post of Saragarhi. It was never meant to be a fortress, only a relay point for communication. Yet fate would soon turn that simple station into a monument of courage remembered for generations. The soldiers stationed there belonged to the 36th Sikh Regiment of the British Indian Army. The Sikh soldiers, descendants of a proud warrior tradition, served with loyalty and discipline. Their religion, founded by Guru Nanak and carried forward by 10 enlightened gurus, taught them that true bravery lay in righteousness, and that to protect others was a sacred duty. To them, the battlefield was not a place of hatred, but of service, a ground upon which one could live and die with honor. In the months before the siege, tension in the frontier had grown like gathering storm clouds. British political control over the tribal areas was shallow at best. Taxes, foreign laws, and the presence of distant rulers had stirred resentment among the tribes. Many felt that their traditions were threatened, their autonomy lost. And so, rebellion began to whisper again through the valleys. By the early days of September 1897, reports from scouts spoke of tribal gatherings near the Orakzai and Afridi territories, thousands of warriors uniting under a call for resistance. They were not armies in the modern sense, but proud fighters bound by loyalty to their clans and faith. Their goal was clear: to strike at the British forts and drive the Empire's presence from their lands. Fort Lockhart, perched on one ridge, could see parts of the movement through its telescopes. The officers stationed there ordered heightened alertness. Saragarhi, being the smallest post between Lockhart and Gulistan, was instructed to maintain constant watch. Inside Saragarhi's modest walls, Havildar Ishar Singh and his men received the updates through the heliograph, those brief flashes of sunlight that carried messages across miles of rocky terrain. Each new signal spoke of approaching danger, yet none of the men wavered. For them, it was not just an imperial duty, it was a soldier's duty, something that transcended politics. Many of these men had served together for years. They had faced the cold of the frontier nights and the isolation of a post where no visitor ever came. Their camaraderie was their greatest strength. One of the younger soldiers, Sepoy Gurmukh Singh, served as the heliograph operator. Only a teenager by age, he carried a deep sense of devotion to his comrades. His role was vital, for without his skill in signaling, both Fort Lockhart and Fort Gulistan would be blind to one another. He was the voice of Saragarhi across the mountains. Meanwhile, on the opposite slopes, campfires of the tribal warriors began to light up the horizon. The valleys glowed with an uneasy orange haze. Messengers brought news that the number of fighters had grown beyond several thousands. Estimates spoke of 10,000 men ready to strike. In Fort Lockhart, British officers debated their next move. To send reinforcements was nearly impossible. The terrain was treacherous, and any relief force would have to pass through narrow passes already occupied by the tribes. All they could do was communicate, prepare, and rely on the small outpost that linked them: Saragarhi. The British administration, stretched thin across its empire, underestimated the spirit of both sides, the defiance of the tribes and the loyalty of the Sikhs who guarded the frontier. Neither side would yield easily. As dawn approached on the day before the battle, Ishar Singh gathered his men for prayer. They stood in a circle, heads bowed, their voices rising softly with the verses of the Ardas, the Sikh prayer for strength and courage. Around them, the wind carried the smell of dust and dry grass. The horizon burned with the faintest red glow of sunrise, a warning of what was to come. In that moment, there was no empire, no politics, and no promises of reward. There was only duty, the kind that binds a soldier to his brothers and a man to his honor. The sound of distant drums echoed once again through the valleys. From Fort Lockhart came a message: "Movement confirmed. Enemy gathering in thousands. Stand prepared." Ishar Singh watched the message flash across the mirror, his expression calm. He turned to his men and said softly, "The day we have waited for has come. Let the world see how soldiers keep their word." The men nodded, their faces illuminated by the morning sun. The stage was set. The mountains waited in silence, and somewhere in the distance the first shadows of the advancing warriors began to darken the ridges. The morning of September 12th, 1897, arrived with a deceptive calm. The air over the Samana Range was thin and clear, the sky stretched endlessly blue above the barren slopes. Yet beneath that stillness, an invisible tension trembled like a bowstring pulled tight. From the watchtower of Saragarhi, Havildar Ishar Singh surveyed the horizon. Through the thin mountain mist, he could see faint dust clouds gathering in the distance, not of wind, but of movement. The first ranks of the tribal warriors had begun to appear, descending from the hills in waves. Their banners shimmered faintly in the light, and their chants rolled across the valley like distant thunder. Ishar Singh turned toward the heliograph station where Sepoy Gurmukh Singh, the youngest of his men, stood ready. "Signal to Fort Lockhart," he commanded calmly. Gurmukh's mirrors flashed in the morning light. Enemy approaching in large numbers, awaiting orders. The reply came swiftly. Hold position. Reinforcements cannot reach in time. Do your duty. Those few words carried the weight of destiny. Ishar Singh read them once, nodded, and spoke to his men. "Brothers," he said, his voice steady and clear, "we have our orders. We hold Saragarhi." No man questioned him. They had known this moment might come, and now it was here. As the sun climbed higher, the landscape transformed into a vast sea of movement. The warriors, now visible in thousands, advanced with purpose. They surrounded the small outpost from all sides, cutting off every route of escape. From Fort Lockhart, officers could see the spectacle through their telescopes, a storm of humanity converging on a handful of defenders. But distance made them powerless. Inside Saragarhi, the 21 soldiers prepared with calm precision. They reinforced the gates with sandbags and stones. Water jars were filled, ammunition was counted, and positions were assigned. Despite the enormity of what faced them, there was no sign of panic. Each man carried the spirit of his ancestors, the warrior saints who had taught that duty and courage must walk together. Their faith was their armor. "Do you think they know how few we are?" asked Lance Naik Chanda Singh, adjusting his rifle near the wall. "They will soon find out," replied Ishar Singh, almost smiling, "and they will learn what that means." The men chuckled softly, a brief moment of warmth amid the gathering storm. From beyond the walls, the call to surrender soon came. A voice echoed in the valley, one of the tribal leaders urging the defenders to lay down their arms. Ishar Singh listened in silence, then turned to his men. "They ask for surrender," he said evenly, "but we do not answer with words. We answer with our duty." He ordered Gurmukh Singh to flash a message to Fort Lockhart. "We are surrounded by thousands. Position will be defended." That signal, gleaming in the morning light, became more than just a message. It was a vow. The first attacks came shortly after noon. The warriors, now numbering in the thousands, advanced toward the outer walls. Their shouts echoed through the hills as they surged forward. Dust rose like smoke, partially veiling the field. Inside the fort, Ishar Singh directed his men calmly. "Hold your fire," he said. "Wait until they come closer." When the attackers reached the outer perimeter, Ishar Singh raised his hand. "Now!" A sharp volley rang out. The defenders' rifles spoke as one. The first assault faltered under their disciplined fire. The tribesmen fell back, regrouping behind rocks and ridges. From the tower, Gurmukh Singh continued signaling updates to Fort Lockhart, each flash of light cutting through the haze. The officers at Lockhart read every message in anxious silence. They could see the swarm of warriors and hear faint echoes of gunfire drifting across the hills, but the distance was too great for aid. All they could do was watch as the tiny fort fought on against impossible odds. Hours passed. The sun began to lean westward, turning the rocks red and gold. The air smelled of dust and smoke. Within Saragarhi, the men remained unbroken. They moved from wall to wall, encouraging one another, tending to the wounded, and keeping their communication with Fort Lockhart alive. At one point, Ishar Singh paused beside Gurmukh Singh. "Are you still signaling, son?" "Yes, Havildar Sahib," the young man answered, his eyes fixed on the mirrors. "Every word." "Good," said Ishar Singh softly. "Then the world will know what happened here." Outside, the warriors regrouped for another assault. They built makeshift barricades to shield themselves as they advanced. Their determination was as fierce as that of the men within the fort. They were fighting for their homeland. The Sikhs were defending their honor. It was not hatred that clashed at Saragarhi, but conviction. The second attack came more forcefully, shaking the small fort's walls. Stones crumbled, dust rose, and yet the soldiers stood firm. Every man fought as if his single life was worth 1,000. By late afternoon, the situation had grown dire. Ammunition was running low, and parts of the wall had begun to weaken. Ishar Singh gathered his men once more. "Brothers," he said, "we have done what soldiers are meant to do. Whatever happens next, we will face it together." He looked at the setting sun, a red circle sinking behind the mountains, and added quietly, "Let the Empire remember that at Saragarhi, duty stood taller than fear." The men bowed their heads in agreement. The next wave of warriors was already advancing. As the shadows lengthened, Gurmukh Singh sent his final message for the day. The enemy attacks again. The battle continues. We stand. Those flashes of light reached Fort Lockhart and burned themselves into history. The officers who saw them knew that the small outpost was still holding, still defying the storm that had risen to swallow it whole. The night would soon fall over the mountains, but Saragarhi still stood, a flicker of courage against an ocean of fury. As twilight deepened over the Samana hills, Havildar Ishar Singh stood upon the battered wall of Saragarhi and gazed at the fading horizon. The last streaks of sunlight painted the mountains in crimson gold, and the wind carried the faint murmur of drums from the surrounding valleys. Night was coming, and with it the enemy's next move. Inside the fort, the 21 Sikh soldiers prepared themselves quietly. They were weary, but not broken. Their faces, marked by dust and determination, glowed faintly in the flickering light of oil lamps. The young sepoy Gurmukh Singh, still at his heliograph, turned his mirrors one last time toward Fort Lockhart. The message flashed through the dusk. "We hold our ground. The night falls, but our spirit stands." The officers miles away watched the light fade and whispered prayers. They knew those men were writing their own chapter of history, one flash of sunlight at a time. Among the defenders, Ishar Singh was more than a leader. He was the heart of the fort. His men looked to him not only for orders, but for courage, for calm, for faith. He was not a man born into comfort or privilege. He had grown up in the plains of Punjab, in a small village surrounded by fields of wheat and mustard. As a young boy, he had learned from his elders the sacred duty of the Khalsa, to defend truth, protect the innocent, and live without fear. When he joined the army, he carried those lessons into every battle, every patrol, every long silent watch on the frontier. The men often said that Havildar Ishar Singh could stand as firm as the mountains themselves. He never raised his voice in anger, never demanded loyalty. He inspired it. In his presence, fear seemed smaller. Now, as the walls of Saragarhi trembled under distant drums, he walked among his soldiers with steady steps. He stopped beside Lance Naik Chanda Singh, who was reinforcing a section of the gate. "How is your post?" Ishar asked. "Strong, Havildar Sahib," Chanda replied, forcing a smile, "but the stones are tired." "Then we will lend them our strength," Ishar said with quiet humor. "The stones will hold, because we will hold." A ripple of soft laughter followed, the kind born not of joy, but of courage. Later, as the men shared a few remaining rations, Ishar Singh gathered them in a circle. The night was still, and the stars glittered above like 1,000 silent witnesses. "My brothers," he began, his voice carrying through the darkness, "you all know what lies beyond these walls. You have seen their numbers. Yet here we are, 21 soldiers standing between two forts, holding the line for all who depend on us. The world may forget names, but it never forgets deeds, and what we do here today and tomorrow will be remembered long after we are gone." The men listened in silence. Even the youngest among them, Gurmukh Singh, felt the weight of those words settle deep in his heart. "What gives a soldier his strength?" Ishar continued. "It is not his rifle, nor his walls. It is his faith, faith in his duty, faith in his brothers, and faith that truth is worth standing for, even when the world stands against you." He paused, then bowed his head briefly. "We have prayed to our Guru, and we have done our part. The rest is in the hands of the Almighty." A gentle murmur of "Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh." The Khalsa belongs to God, and victory belongs to God, rose among them, echoing softly against the stones. As the men returned to their posts, Ishar Singh took a moment alone. He looked out beyond the walls, where campfires of the opposing army glowed like stars scattered across the dark hills. He could hear faint voices carried by the wind, songs, chants, the restless hum of thousands waiting for dawn. For a moment, he allowed himself to think of home. He saw the faces of his parents, the golden fields of his youth, the quiet rivers that ran through Punjab, but he felt no sadness. Instead, a strange calm settled over him. He knew that true peace did not come from safety, but from knowing that one's life had meaning. He whispered softly, "If I must stand my last day here, let it be with my brothers, in the light of duty." Inside the fort, Gurmukh Singh watched him from the tower. To the young signaller, Ishar Singh seemed larger than life, a man of unshakable faith. Gurmukh wondered how such calm could exist in such danger. When Ishar looked up and met his gaze, the boy quickly straightened, embarrassed to be caught staring. "Keep the signals ready," Ishar said kindly. "You are our voice, Gurmukh. Through you, the world will know what happens here." "Yes, Havildar Sahib," the boy replied. "Good," said Ishar, smiling faintly. "Then let the world hear courage in your light." The hours passed slowly. The fort stood silent except for the whisper of the wind through its narrow gates. The men took turns resting in brief shifts, rifles within reach. Each knew that when dawn came, the next assault would begin. Yet there was no despair, only resolve, quiet, steady, and sacred. Above them, the stars turned across the sky, indifferent yet eternal. Below them, thousands waited to strike, and within those stone walls, 21 soldiers, led by one man's unyielding heart, prepared to make history. As Ishar Singh finally closed his eyes for a moment's rest, the words of the prayer lingered in his mind. "Grant me this boon, O Lord. May I never fear when I go into battle." When dawn crept across the mountains on September 13th, the stillness of the early light did not bring peace. It was the calm before a storm that would be remembered for generations. The men of Saragarhi rose with the first call of the morning prayer. Their voices joined in harmony, echoing softly through the stone walls. "O Lord, grant us the strength to walk the path of truth." The simple prayer carried through the valley, carried by the wind as if nature itself listened in reverence. From his post at the tower, Sepoy Gurmukh Singh adjusted the heliograph mirrors toward Fort Lockhart. He sent his first signal of the day. "Enemy still surrounding the post. We stand prepared." The light from the mirrors flickered across the distance and reached the officers watching anxiously from the ridge. In Fort Lockhart, British and Indian soldiers alike paused to read the message. Their hearts filled with both pride and sorrow. Pride for the courage of their comrades, sorrow for knowing they could not reach them in time. As the sun climbed higher, the mountain air trembled once more with the sound of drums and the low roar of thousands of voices. The tribal warriors, united in their cause, began to advance again, their banners fluttering against the sky. From the tower, the defenders could see the waves of movement rising like a tide from every side. Inside Saragarhi, Havildar Ishar Singh called his men together. "They're coming again," he said simply. "Remember who we are. Remember why we stand." The soldiers took their places. Each knew his position, each understood that this day might be his last. And yet, none wavered. From the far ridge, officers at Fort Lockhart raised their telescopes. Through the haze, they could see the tiny fort of Saragarhi, barely visible amid the dust. From that distance, the scene was haunting, a small dot of defiance surrounded by an ocean of movement. Yet still, every few minutes, flashes of sunlight came from the fort, the heliograph signals, proof that the defenders still stood. "Sir," one officer said softly, "they are still sending messages." The commanding officer, his voice heavy with emotion, replied, "Then they are still alive. God grant them strength." The soldiers at Lockhart could do nothing but watch and record each signal, each brief communication that carried the heartbeat of courage across the miles. By midday, the sound of the assault grew louder. The defenders could hear the approaching chants. Dust and echoes filled the air. Inside the fort, Lance Naik Chanda Singh looked toward the young signaller. "Gurmukh," he said, "keep your mirrors bright. Let them see our light, no matter what happens." "I will," Gurmukh replied. His hands trembled slightly, but his eyes were clear. He sent another message. "Enemy attack renewed. We resist with full strength." At Fort Lockhart, the officers read the words in silence. Someone whispered, "They're fighting the whole frontier with 21 men." Another voice answered, "No, they're fighting with 21 hearts." As the hours passed, the noise of the assault echoed across the valleys. From Fort Gulistan on the opposite ridge, soldiers too could hear the faint thunder. The whole frontier seemed to listen to the heartbeat of Saragarhi. By afternoon, smoke began to rise from the small post, a signal that the fighting had reached its fiercest. The watchers at Fort Lockhart could see that the enemy had surrounded the walls completely, yet still the tiny flashes of light came from the fort. Gurmukh's messages continued, each one shorter, more urgent. "The walls are weakening. We fight on. Havildar Sahib leads us with courage. We will not yield." Each flash of sunlight was a spark of spirit, carrying their courage across the mountains. Inside the fort, Ishar Singh moved with calm purpose. He directed his men, encouraged the weary, and stood at the front lines wherever the danger grew most intense. His presence alone seemed to steady everyone around him. At one point, Sepoy Bhagwan Singh, his uniform coated in dust, turned to him and asked, "Havildar Sahib, do you think anyone will remember us?" Ishar Singh looked at him, his face serene. "The world remembers those who stand when others fall," he said, "and we stand together." Those words settled into every heart. They knew now that their fight had become something greater than survival. It was a testament to loyalty, courage, and unity. Meanwhile, far from the frontier, news of the uprising had begun to travel through the empire. Telegrams from Peshawar and Rawalpindi carried reports of renewed tribal movements. But none yet knew of the quiet storm brewing at Saragarhi, of the 21 men holding a fort that should have fallen hours ago. In Fort Lockhart, as evening approached, the officers watched the final flashes of light from the heliograph fade into the setting sun. The messages stopped. The mountain grew quiet again. A heavy silence filled the air. One young officer lowered his telescope and whispered, "They fought until the light died." Another nodded, his eyes glistening. And even then, they still sent light. That night, the frontier slept uneasily. The mountains seemed to mourn in their silence. Yet, somewhere in that quiet darkness, the story of Saragarhi began to spread, from fort to fort, from regiment to regiment. Soldiers spoke of the 21 Sikhs who held their post against 10,000 and sent their last message not in words, but in unwavering light. Their stand would soon echo beyond the frontier, reaching London, Lahore, and every corner of India. But for that night, the hills held their secret in reverent stillness, a story written not in glory or victory, but in the timeless language of courage. He raised his sword and pointed toward the gate, where the enemy's battering ram struck again and again. Each thud made the wooden beams shudder, splinter by splinter. At the heliograph station, Sepoy Gurmukh Singh sent what would be his final message to Fort Lockhart. "The enemy has reached the walls. We have fought to the last. Request permission to stop signaling and join battle." From across the valley, officers at Lockhart watched the flash of mirrors through the smoke. The message arrived, and the commanding officer's throat tightened. "Permission granted," he replied softly, though he knew the young signaller might never see it. As the mirrors fell silent, so too did the mountain wind. For the first time that day, there were no signals, only the sound of war closing in. The gate crashed open. The tribal warriors surged forward, their shouts filling the air. But before they could flood the courtyard, Ishar Singh charged. With his rifle in one hand and his sword in the other, he led the counterattack. Alone at first, then joined by his men. The Sikhs met the invaders head-on, their steel flashing under the dying sun. Bullets whistled, swords clashed, and the cries of both sides mingled in chaos. Lance Naik Chanda Singh fell near the wall after taking a spear wound to the chest, but even as he collapsed, he fired one last shot. Sepoy Bhagwan Singh fought beside Ishar, his bayonet glinting as he pushed back 3 enemies at once. Blood soaked the earth, yet none of them yielded ground. In the center of the chaos, Ishar Singh's voice rose again. "Hold the line." The warriors swarmed around him, but he fought like a storm, every motion swift, controlled, fierce. Even when wounded, he stood tall, shouting the Sikh war cry again and again until his voice was swallowed by the roar of battle. One by one, his men fell, not retreating, not pleading, only fighting. Sepoy Lal Singh, the youngest among them, fought beside the tower stairs until his rifle jammed. He drew his kirpan and continued to strike, shouting until his voice broke. At the same time, Gurmukh Singh, having sent his last message, set aside the heliograph mirrors. He looked up toward the sky for a moment, whispering the same prayer they had spoken that morning. "O Lord, grant us the strength to walk the path of truth." Then he picked up his rifle. The enemy breached the inner wall. The defenders had fallen back to the courtyard, forming a tight circle around the tower. Smoke filled the air, stinging their eyes. From above, the young signaller shouted, "Sahib, they are inside." Ishar Singh, bleeding and exhausted, looked up and gave a single nod. "Then we fight from the heart, not the walls." He charged once more, his sword raised high. Witnesses later said that his final stand was so fierce that even the attackers hesitated, struck by the sight of a man who refused to die without meaning. When at last he fell, surrounded by enemies, his sword was still raised. Only one defender remained, Gurmukh Singh in the tower. He barred the door and loaded his rifle. Through a gap in the stone, he could see the enemy swarming below. His face was pale, but his hands were steady. Outside, they called for him to surrender. He did not answer. Instead, he aimed through the slit and fired. One shot, then another, and another. Each bullet struck true. Each echo carried the spirit of the fallen 20. When his ammunition was gone, he sat beside the heliograph and closed his eyes. For a moment, he listened to the wind, soft, cold, carrying faint echoes of the battle cries that had shaken the mountains that day. Then, with a deep breath, he rose again, drew his kirpan, and shouted the words his comrades had shouted, "Jo Bol, So Nihal, Sat Shri Akal." The attackers stormed the tower. The sound of struggle echoed, then faded. When silence finally returned to Saragarhi, the sun had already dipped below the horizon. The fort was in ruins, but it had not fallen in spirit. From Fort Lockhart, the soldiers who had watched through telescopes saw the last of the smoke drifting away. None dared to speak. At last, one officer whispered, "They are gone." Another replied quietly, "No. They have become the mountain." That night, a wind swept through the frontier, whispering through the stones and valleys. A wind that carried the courage of 21 men who had stood against 10,000. The story of Saragarhi would soon travel far beyond those hills, carried by soldiers and storytellers alike. But for that moment, in the stillness after the storm, the mountains held their silence, as if bowing in honor of those who had turned an ordinary outpost into immortal legend. The next morning, as the sun rose over the northwest frontier, its light revealed a silence unlike any other. Saragarhi Fort, once echoing with the sounds of rifles and voices, now stood in ruins. Its walls shattered, its gate broken, but its spirit unbroken. From Fort Lockhart, British and Indian officers looked through their telescopes toward the outpost that had fallen silent the previous evening. A haze of smoke still lingered. The flag of the Sikh regiment no longer fluttered above the tower, yet the sight commanded a deep, almost sacred stillness. Major Devu of the 36th Sikh Regiment stood at the parapet, his jaw clenched. For hours he had watched the flashes of the heliograph, reading each message that came from Saragarhi. The last, a farewell. He turned to his adjutant. "They held the fort," he said softly, "to the last man." Word spread quickly among the soldiers. The 21 defenders of Saragarhi had been overwhelmed by 10,000 attackers, and yet had fought until none remained standing. Later that day, reinforcements marched toward the fort. The path was long and steep, winding through dry ravines and sharp stones. When they finally reached Saragarhi, they stopped in silence. The place was a wreck of charred wood, crumbled stone, and scattered rifles. The air smelled faintly of smoke and dust. Yet there, near the gate, they found signs of an extraordinary stand. Weapons fired until the barrels were hot, cartridges piled in heaps, and marks on the wall where the defenders had stood shoulder to shoulder. Among the ruins, they discovered the body of Havildar Ishar Singh, lying near the gate where the final assault had come. His sword was still in his hand. Nearby were the others, their rifles beside them, their faces calm, as if they had fallen in prayer. The men who found them did not speak. Many removed their turbans and bowed their heads. One officer wrote later, "We had found no fort, only a shrine." News of the battle traveled fast. Within weeks, every cantonment across India spoke of Saragarhi. British officers, astonished by the scale of the stand, compared it to the most legendary last battles in military history: Thermopylae, Rorke's Drift, and the Alamo. In Lahore, newspapers published the story, calling it the defense of the impossible. Letters poured in from across the empire, praising the courage of the Sikh soldiers who had chosen duty over life. When the story reached London, it was read aloud in the British Parliament. The members of the House of Commons stood in respect, an honor rarely given to colonial troops. One voice declared, "These men fought not for reward, but for the sacredness of their oath." Queen Victoria herself received the report. Deeply moved, she ordered that every soldier who fought at Saragarhi be posthumously awarded the Indian Order of Merit, the highest award of bravery available to Indian soldiers, the equivalent of the Victoria Cross. Each medal bore their name, engraved carefully so that none would be forgotten. In the villages of Punjab, the news reached families who had been waiting for their sons, husbands, and brothers. When messengers brought the word, there was both sorrow and pride. Mothers wept, but they did not curse fate. They said their sons had become immortal. In one village, a priest stood before the community and said, "The land of Punjab has given 21 lions to history. The world will speak their names as long as courage is remembered." Songs were composed. Ballads of Saragarhi, sung by farmers and soldiers alike. They told of a lonely outpost on the edge of empire, where 21 men had faced a sea of warriors and had not stepped back. Children grew up hearing those songs, and when they asked why the men had not fled, their elders answered, "Because a Sikh never abandons his post." Meanwhile, in the British Indian Army, the story of Saragarhi became a lesson in honor and loyalty. Military academies retold it to young recruits, teaching that courage was not measured by victory, but by steadfastness. One officer wrote in his diary, "They have shown us that duty is not a word of orders, but of the soul." The surviving forts, Lockhart and Gulistan, owed their safety to the time Saragarhi's defenders had bought with their lives. Without that delay, the tribal forces might have overrun both positions. Even the enemy later acknowledged the bravery of the Sikhs, remarking that they fought like men of faith. Months later, a memorial service was held at the regimental base. A granite pillar was raised, engraved with the names of all 21 soldiers. Beneath the names, a single line was carved in both English and Gurmukhi. They fought to the end, for duty, for honor, for one another. As the last prayer ended, the wind picked up. gentle, steady, carrying across the plains as if the mountains themselves were whispering in remembrance. That day, the regiment swore a vow, never to let their story be forgotten. In the years that followed, September 12th was declared Saragarhi Day, a commemoration observed by Sikh regiments around the world. Soldiers would gather, recount the events, and bow their heads in respect. Even decades later, as wars came and went, Saragarhi remained a beacon, not of conquest, but of courage beyond reason. For though 21 men had fallen, their spirit had risen far higher than any victory could reach. Time moved on, as it always does, but the story of Saragarhi refused to fade. Long after the smoke had cleared and the empires had changed, the names of 21 Sikh soldiers continued to echo across history like an unending hymn to courage. In the Punjab plains, farmers told the story beside the fields, their voices carrying through the evening air. Soldiers recited it around campfires before new battles. Teachers spoke of it in schools as an example of integrity and faith, and at every mention of Saragarhi, there was always a pause, a respectful silence for those who had stood firm when standing firm meant certain death. Years after the battle, a small memorial gurdwara was built in Amritsar, the sacred city of the Sikhs. Its white dome shone in the sunlight, simple yet majestic. On its walls were carved the names of the defenders, each one a story of devotion and duty. Pilgrims would enter quietly, bow their heads, and whisper prayers not of sorrow, but of gratitude. Another memorial rose near Firozapur, where the regiment had once trained. Soldiers in crisp uniforms would gather there every year on Saragarhi Day, the 12th of September. Trumpets would sound, hymns would be sung, and the air would tremble with pride. The ceremony was not one of mourning, but of remembrance, for the men of Saragarhi had not died in despair. They had lived in honor. The story was told again and again, not merely as history, but as a lesson that transcended time. In military academies around the world, Saragarhi became a study in courage and leadership. It was compared to the stand of King Leonidas at Thermopylae, yet with a difference that made it unique. The soldiers of Saragarhi fought not for kings or conquests, but for their duty for each other and for the belief that to uphold one's post was sacred. A British officer once remarked, "At Saragarhi, courage was not commanded, it was chosen." The Sikh soldiers' last stand embodied the ancient teaching of the Khalsa, the spiritual brotherhood founded by Guru Gobind Singh, that a true warrior fights for righteousness, not for personal glory. Their cry, "Jo Bole So Nihal, Sat Shri Akal," had not been a shout of anger, but a declaration of truth. Blessed is the one who speaks the truth, for God is eternal. As decades passed, the battle became more than a chapter in military history. It became a mirror reflecting the deepest human values: bravery, loyalty, faith, and the will to stand firm in the face of overwhelming odds. During the World Wars, Sikh soldiers carried the memory of Saragarhi with them into the trenches of France, the deserts of Africa, and the jungles of Burma. Many said they felt the spirit of their 21 forebears beside them when fear closed in. In modern India, the story is still told every September. School children read about it, soldiers salute it, and historians write of it with reverence. The Indian Army's Sikh Regiment, one of the most decorated in the world, continues to honor that legacy, a legacy written not in conquest, but in sacrifice. Beyond military honor, Saragarhi also became a story for all humanity. It taught that courage is not measured by numbers, nor by victory, but by the strength of conviction. The defenders of Saragarhi were few, yet in their steadfastness they revealed something universal, that the human spirit, when guided by purpose, can transcend fear. In every corner of the world, from London to Ludhiana, from Delhi to Vancouver, memorials and commemorations remind people that true bravery is not loud or cruel. It is calm, disciplined, and rooted in love for duty and truth. Many years later, a historian visiting the site of Saragarhi stood before the ruins that still mark the old stone walls. The sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in hues of amber and crimson. The wind that moved through the broken towers seemed to whisper the echoes of the past. He wrote in his journal, "The fort stands no more, yet its spirit stands taller than ever. These stones do not speak, but they remember." And indeed, the memory remained, not as the story of a battle lost, but of a spirit that triumphed. In the present day, Saragarhi continues to inspire new generations, in films, in books, in classrooms, and in the hearts of those who believe that honor is eternal. It is a reminder that courage is not an act of defiance, but of faith, that even in solitude the right thing is worth standing for. The 21 men of Saragarhi had no promise of victory, no witness to their deeds, and no chance of survival. Yet they fought, not to be remembered, but because they believed their duty was sacred, and that, perhaps, is the greatest legacy of all. As dusk falls on the rugged hills where the fort once stood, the wind carries the faint echo of a cry that once shook the mountains. A cry not of war, but of truth. Jo Bol, So Nihal, Sat Shri Akal. It is said that if one listens closely, that echo still lingers among the stones of Saragarhi, whispering through the silence, reminding all who pass that courage once kindled never dies.